excited for Dragon Watch 5. By the way, Renone is totally going to turn into a demon at the end. So, as anyone knows, with any good release, you have to reread every single book that came before it, and this, my friends, is no exception, not by a long shot. So, let's take a look back where it all began, with Fablehaven. So the first thing he does right off the bat is start the mystery of what's really going on here. At first glance, this might seem like a bad move, considering that anyone who's read the back cover already knows the answer. But if you look at it more closely, it does fulfill a couple important roles. Firstly, it introduces all of the main elements of the story. While any good first act does this, the brilliant thing about this one is that all of the elements that play a part in the climax, the fairies, the pond, Muriel, and Goldilocks, have been introduced by page 50, and with the exception of Muriel, we don't even know it. The second thing is that it makes the story flow more naturally. If Brenmull had just tried to shove the whole thing into just chapter 1 and get on with the story, the pacing and the structure and the character development would have just fallen apart. And it also gives us a standing point for us to see Kendra and Seth, seeing how they act when there isn't impending doom hanging over their heads. Third thing that it accomplishes is it introduces the theme of deception. And deception plays a very big part in the Fablehaven world. Nearly every book is driven by betrayal, because the villain of every book is a traitor. And the reason half of the story happens is because of falling for deception. The fiasco with the fairies is the next little section of the book, and this one is mostly centered around Seth's character arc, and I think this is where Seth really begins moving towards the truth. We'll talk about that in great detail later in the video. This section of the story also introduces the Society of the Evening Star, and the idea that the magical community is a lot bigger than just Fablehaven. And it also stresses the importance of Muriel and the fairies, and also that Muriel can turn an animal back into a person, which of course makes it seem completely illogical to go to Muriel once Grandma Sorensen reveals herself later in the book. But only for the price of a knot, of course. And right on time, it's the midpoint, and it's not Seth's fault, but it's Seth's fault. Yeah, we'll talk about that later. It's a really good midpoint in and of itself, but its fatal flaw here is that it doesn't keep the story going effectively. The 2-3 chapters in between the midpoint and when Goldilocks reveals herself to be Grandma Sorensen drag so very much, and there's nothing really keeping the story going aside from Kendra and Seth, and well, Kendra and Seth don't have anything to go off of, aside from a trail of footprints that doesn't actually mean anything. While this section does introduce Newell and Doran, which is cool because Newell and Doran, this could have definitely been made a lot more compelling. And while the pacing is known for taking its time, this bit of the book is kind of a stretch, and it probably would have been better if it had been shortened or cut. So one of the annoying things about being an author is you spend 90% of your book getting your hero into more and more trouble. But the problem is, unless you're writing a tragedy, at some point you have to get your hero out of all that trouble. And one very tempting way to do this is Deus Ex Machina. And it's a term I'm sure you've heard before, where someone other than the hero ends up saving the day. And while the climax of Fablehaven doesn't directly fit into the standard Deus Ex Machina definition, it's definitely still a type of it. And I'm going to call it Kendra Ex Machina, because after all, she is the one who created it. And essentially, it's where the hero is the one to resolve the conflict, but they do it using some ultra-powerful magical artifact that someone else gave them, or they just picked up somewhere. And while, I have to be honest, ultra-powerful magical artifacts are cool, this still isn't a satisfying way to resolve your conflict. And some could argue that the real climactic moment is when Kendra goes to the Fairy Queen's pond. And in many ways, for Kendra, and for Kendra's arc, it is. But for the plot, the conflict is resolved by the fairies. And this isn't just Fablehaven. It also resolves the main conflict in Grip of the Shadow Plague, He's the Demon Prison, and Master of the Phantom Isle. And the only real difference is that the magical artifacts get progressively more powerful. And while there aren't a ton of open options here, the climax probably would have played out better as a confrontation with just Kendra and Muriel. But the only downside to this is that Kendra wouldn't have been made fairy-kind, which is very important for the rest of the series, keeping on the tradition. So Kendra and Seth have what I call a twin arc, and it's essentially where one's lie is the other's truth and one's truth is the other's lie. I made a whole video about it. And both of them are striving towards a greater truth. And for Kendra and Seth, it's courage and caution, so the greater truth is calculated courage. Again, see the Twin Arcs video. Now let's start with Seth's arc. Now we see right off the bat that Seth's a very courageous, outgoing kid, and he doesn't always put a ton of thought into things first. This was the kid who jumped off the roof under the misguided assumption that a garbage bag would work as a parachute. And the beginning of Seth's arc is both the fiasco of the fairies and Midsummer Eve, and while he doesn't make a ton of progress in this book, there does seem to be a tad more thought put into the risk he took with Nero's logs. Kendra, on the other hand, has a full arc for this book, and we see potential for it when she's investigating the clues of Fablehaven, and but her arc doesn't really start until Midsummer Eve, when she's forced out into the unknown. And the climactic moment of this arc is, of course, when she goes to the Fairy Queen's pond, And this is the grand turning point in Kendra's arc. And while she does make a bit of a relapse in Book 2, in and of Book 1, it is a full arc. But speaking of Book 2, so the main role Fablehaven serves as part of the greater series is to introduce all of the elements, the plot, the characters, the Society of the Evening Star, the Fairy Queen, Kendra's status as Fairy Kind. And while there isn't a ton of time dedicated to foreshadowing the Society of the Evening Star, it's done very well. Enough to let the reader know, like, yeah, these are going to be a problem later, but not too much where they're crowding on the antagonist of this book, Muriel. And while the main role in the overall series is to introduce us to the world before the story can really begin, it can stand on its own and be just fine. So that's Fablehaven. Make sure to leave your Dragon Watch predictions down in the comments, and don't forget to keep an eye out for fairies.